This podcast is sponsored by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com.
Welcome to Permission to Speak, the video blog and podcast that loiters at the intersection of leaders who want their people to speak up, technology that facilitates connections, and results that serve our higher purpose. Now, here's your host, Kelly Vandever.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Kelly Vandever, and my special guest today is Dennis Reina. Now, am I pronouncing your name right?
Absolutely. Right.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Dennis Reina, PhD, is the co-founder, along with his life and business partner, Michelle Reina, PhD, of Reina, a consulting firm that builds trust in organizations. He's the co-author of two best-selling business books, Trust and Betrayal in the Workplace, Building Effective Relationships in Your Organization, and Rebuilding Trust in the Workplace, 7 Steps to Renew Confidence, Commitment, and Energy. Dennis and Michelle's work has been featured in Bloomberg Businessweek, Harvard Management Update, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, USA Today, CNBC, and CNN. Their clients include Amex, Ben & Jerry's, Harvard University, Johnson & Johnson, Lincoln Financial Group, Miller Coors, Nokia, Toyota, Turner Broadcasting, Walt Disney World, and the United States Treasury Department. Now, when I first met Dennis and he was telling me about his work with trust, I thought, okay, I've got to talk to him on the podcast because I think the reason why people don't speak up at work has a lot to do with trust. So welcome, Dennis, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, as you know, we start out with a couple of quirky questions and then transition into some more relevant questions to the content of trust in this case. But my first quirky question for you is, what is your favorite possession?
Well, my favorite possession is actually my flexibility, both of mind and body. And for example, I've been stretching every day for the last 36 years for about 15, 20 minutes a day. And I am very flexible, particularly for my age. I'm 66 years old. And I can do a split eagle. I can do but what's important is also my physical flexibility affects my mental agility and flexibility as well. For example, I can take a look at an argument or a discussion and look at both sides and see value in each. And that also helps me deal with uncertainty, ambiguity, helps me deal with change. My flexibility to be able to be resilient. I'm a 2-time cancer survivor, a near-death accident. I've been through a lot, shingles, the whole bit. And I believe that my flexibility and that resilience contributes to that.
Wow. So what kind of stretching do you do? I'm just curious.
Well, it's kind of my eclectic combination of Eastern and Western yoga and stretching. It doesn't really have a name per se. I just kind of do it. But it's, a lot of floor stretches and keeps me limber and flexible.
Very cool. Well, we'll have to see the splits or something like that at some point. No.
That's for another show.
Okay. So the next quirky question is, tell us something surprising about yourself that most people don't know.
Well, this is probably a 2 or 3 part answer here. But my first job out of college, I was actually, let me back up a little bit. I went to school, University of Maryland, as an undergrad, 68 through 72. So I'm dating myself a little bit. But as anybody that came through that era, that was the Vietnam War, and I was in the first draft, etc. And after graduating, I listened to Horace Greeley. He said, "Go west, young man." And so I did. I packed up the old Dodge Econoline van and headed west and traveled around the States and Canada. And we'd pick up hitchhikers, et cetera, from point A to point B. And, back then in early 70s, you could do that kind of a thing. And I landed in San Francisco on the corner of California and Mason, and on my way to Big Sur with all the other, at the time, hippies. Somebody said, you ought to really check out Yosemite National Park. And I said, okay, I'll bop over there for the weekend. And well, to make a long story short, I drove down into the valley. I don't know, have you ever been to Yosemite?
I have not.
It's just absolutely magnificent. I mean, the walls rise up 3,000 feet.
Wow.
From the valley floor.
Wow.
And it's just absolutely spellbinding, particularly the very first time you see it. But anyway, I drove down, my van broke down. I had to get a whole new transmission. Now, it was going to cost me $867, or it might have been $8,670,000. Doesn't matter. I had about $100 left in my traveler's checks, Back then, we used to travel with cards or anything like that. And so I decided to get a job for 4 weeks to get my van out of hock. And I reported to the personnel office at the time. And the personnel, they call them personnel offices back then versus HR and all of that now. And they said, okay, what do you got? I said, I proudly said, I got a bachelor's degree in marketing from the University of Maryland, business administration, etc. And they looked at me and they said, so what? What else you got? And so I knew I had to dig deep on this one. And so I went through a few things. And then I said, I was 2 merit badges away from Eagle Scout before the troop folded. And they said, great, you're hired. Report to the Mountaineering Center Monday morning. And so I did. And 4 weeks turned into 4 years. I ran a number of both the mountaineering shop and the sports shop, both in Curry Village and Yosemite Village, and learned climbing. And climbing and cross-country skiing. And in fact, one time I took Charlton Heston and his family out.
Get out.
Country skiing. And, when you've got somebody on a wall, whether it be 100 feet or 1,000 feet, it doesn't matter. You learn a lot about trust experientially. And so I wanted to really understand this thing called trust. So anyway, 4 years later, I was invited by Johannes von Trapp of the Trapp Family Lodge in Stowe, Vermont. Now, Johannes was the little boy in the movie.
Yeah.
He was a man at the time. And every Tuesday and Thursday, I used to take Maria von Trapp out cross-country skiing.
Whoa.
And so I worked there for about 4 years. I'm not kind of like on a 4-year plan here. And so, yeah, so that's between Charlton Heston and Maria von Trapp, probably not too many people know that I had my brush with fame with them.
Very cool. Very cool. Awesome. Okay, so transitioning now into something a little more serious. So what is your story? You talked about the mountaineering and the trust that was involved there, but what happened in your life that got you to a place where you cared about this subject about trust and restoring trust?
Sure. Well, it had its roots right there. As I mentioned, with climbing and cross-country skiing. And through my climbing and cross-country experience, I experientially understood what trust was about. I experientially understood what it was, but I really wanted to theoretically and understand the theoretical construct behind it. And, not only what it meant, what builds it, what breaks it, and more importantly, how do you rebuild it and sustain it over time? And so my third job actually led me to Bolton Valley, which was, I started the cross-country center there. and actually did Telemark Tuesday. Telemarking is taking cross-country skis downhill and sort of like giant slalom slope skiing. From there, I also was the assistant director of admissions in Goddard College. And so between that and turned that school around. And then I became the director of training, supervisory and managerial training for the state of Vermont. And that's when I really was dealing with not only training supervisors or potential supervisors or managers, but also started to consult in part-time consulting in addition to the full-time training. And I started my doctorate program then. And my doctorate took me actually to my second master's. My first master's was in holistic health education because I had a near-death accident in Yosemite. I fell and I severely injured my groin area. And so I really wanted to understand health and healing, and actually studied with some pretty amazing leaders in the field at the time, Kenneth Pelletier and George, Michael Spino and George Leonard, and some of the in holistic health education back in the 70s. And so I got my first master's in holistic health. Then I went and got my second master's in organizational development and group therapy and group dynamics, understanding how groups, because from teaching skiing and climbing, I was really fascinated by not only trust, but how people learn and how they take in information. And so that was instrumental in my development. And then on my way to my doctorate, I really wanted to understand this thing called trust. And so that led me through reading all kinds of literature. And what I ended up doing, Kelly, was there wasn't much written. Now, we're talking back in the late 80s and early 90s. There wasn't really much written on trust at the time. So then I went to sort of what I'd call neighboring fields, psychology and death and dying, and studied grief and et cetera, and started to make sense of this. And I graduated with my doctorate in 95, and I did 4 years of postdoctoral work. And that's when I really developed the model, the framework, the instrument, the model, which became the framework for our books, our assessments, just our whole body of work. Now, we're talking at a time when people, trust was not very popular back in the late 80s, early 90s. People, in fact, looked at us like we had three heads. Betrayal, that was a 4-letter word, So we were really pioneers in our field at the time. And we feel very fortunate, for that, to be able to make that kind of a contribution.
Very good. Very cool.
So all of that has informed what I do today, all my past experiences and all my roles and responsibilities of my past.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you for walking us kind of through that journey that you took. So very cool. Now, I'd like to talk about your first book, The Trust and Betrayal in the Workplace. And one thing I found interesting in reading that was you defined betrayal differently than I did. I think of betrayal as something very big and major and earth-shattering, but you define it differently, or you add more to that. Could you explain how you
Sure.
it?
Well, the way you define betrayal is probably the way most people actually think of it, is sort of the big, bad, ugly, dark side of human nature, so to speak. But we actually define it on a continuum from minor to major, from unintentional to intentional. And what we have found, Kelly, is that 90%, particularly in the workplace, 90% of all betrayals are not the big things. It's the little things.
Right.
The little things become insidious because they add up and they accumulate, and then one day people check out. They either walk out the door and you lose 17 years of corporate intelligence, or worse yet, they stay. Then they become the working wounded, and they do as little as they can get away with. So our work is about shedding light on the darkness and really illuminating the fact that these betrayals, even the minor ones, are important to pay attention to, because they can become major if we do not pay attention.
Absolutely. And so could you give some examples of the continuum that you just talked about?
Sure. So, for example, a minor unintentional betrayal might be, and it's always, by the way, it's always in the eye of the beholder. Okay, the person on the receiving end, right? Whether it's major or minor. That's a key understanding. It took me a while to grasp. But just for the sake of demonstration here, a minor betrayal might be like a minor infraction. It could be showing up late to work, okay? Could be not delivering on time, although the not delivering on time, if in fact has great ramifications, then it could be major. But so minor unintentional, maybe not showing up to work on time or not showing up to a meeting on time, one time, say. But if that continues and becomes perpetual, then you have a problem, and it becomes from minor to major, and unintentional to intentional. Another one could be gossiping. Now, gossiping could be innocent, but it's more intentional because you're gossiping when you're gossiping, okay? But that could also be major because I've seen people lose promotional opportunities or lose, $10 million, losing a actual client because of gossip about the client. So again, what is the impact, the intent and the impact will define whether it's minor or major, and whether it's on the receiving end or not. Who the person who is the receiver is kind of the definer of whether it's major or minor. Because, for example, it could be minor to me. Hey, I showed up late to work. What's the big deal? Well, it just happened to be the 9th time in a row, and you've been waiting there, and your time is more precious than mine, et cetera, et cetera. So
right.
It's major or minor. Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. Thank you. So we talked about betrayal a little bit, and I think that was an important point that you make in the book. But let's switch over now and talk about the trust element. So you talk about 3 dimensions of trust, the 3 C's. Yeah. Would you explain those?
Sure.
How you see them?
The 3 C's. Yeah, the 3 C's, the dimensions of trust, the 3 C's. Is our trust of character. We do what we say we're going to do. Our trust of communication is we communicate openly and honestly. And our trust of capability is that we're able to both acknowledge and to leverage the skills and abilities of the people that we are working with. So there are 16 behaviors in all under each of these 3 types of trust. So trust of character, managing expectations, making the implicit explicit, establishing boundaries, making it clear on what's our role and our responsibility, particularly during times of change and transition, delegating appropriately, giving people the skills, the tools, and the authority to carry out the functions we're asking them to carry out. Managing mutually serving intentions, encouraging mutually serving. People ask, well, what's that mean? Well, basically it means is we've got each other's back. We're working on win-win possibilities. I got your back, you got my back. We're in this together. I call it the 3 Musketeers behavior, one for all and all for one, right? Keeping agreements. Of course, that kind of goes without saying, but do we renegotiate when we cannot keep the agreement? And that's a key piece. And then being consistent in our behavior. Do we treat people with dignity and respect, and fairness versus favoritism? So those are the trust of character behaviors. Then there's a host of behaviors for trust of communication, sharing information. How well do we share information? Not just what we think they want to hear, but do we disclose it appropriately and openly? Telling the truth versus putting a spin on the truth. Admitting mistakes, and that's huge when we're able to, first of all, have the safety within the workplace to be able to admit mistakes, and also to, a leader shared with me recently. He said, there's two things that happens when I admit my mistakes. Number one is that I show that I'm human. And number two, it gives my people permission to admit their mistakes.
Absolutely.
And keep peace, because so often it's not okay. It's not okay to admit mistakes. It's not safe enough, to admit mistakes. So it's important that we admit mistakes, give and receive feedback, not just timely, but also trust is about raising awareness. How do we raise awareness? How do we bring people up and along with us? And giving and receiving, if they're doing something, if I'm doing something that's, annoying you, or doing something that isn't working, I need to know so I can correct that behavior. I don't need to hear about it from everybody else because you shared it with everybody else, which brings us up to speaking with good purpose. Speaking with good purpose is talking directly to the individuals involved versus behind their backs.
Right.
And then maintaining confidentiality. We all know how it feels to have something shared in confidence and only to have it leaked out, and find out about it.
So before we go on to the other description of the trust thing, what is it about humans and our behavior that causes us to have trouble speaking the truth, or having those conversations with the person that we have the issue with, as opposed to complaining to somebody else about that person? What is that?
Well, a lot of it's fear. A lot of it is fear. Fear of, first of all, fear of just not being able to do it right. Okay. Like giving people feedback or telling the truth or speaking direct, yes, there's a skill involved. There's no question about it. There's an eloquence and a skill involved. But even just being able in your own way to just share, hey, you know what? Can we have a cup of coffee together? I need to talk about this. It's just, something's bothering me that it's just not working, right? It could be sloppy, it could be messy, but you're sharing it in a vulnerable, honest, open way. That's what's so important. And that's so fear of looking and feeling vulnerable is another way that we sort of get in our way. Fear of not doing it right, fear of feeling vulnerable, fear of retaliation. How will this person respond, and what's going to come back to me? Will they take it in earnest as it is given, or are they going to try to retaliate, etc.? So those are often the reason why we don't openly communicate. We don't honestly, what's on our minds.
Yeah. And it happens, it starts so early in life too. I was interviewing, back in my corporate days, I was in charge of recruiting for our summer interns. And I asked everybody that question about if there was an issue in a group, think back about group project or something in school, and there was an issue that came up. How did you handle it? What was the issue? And there was only one candidate who said, well, we had that come up, and I went and I talked to the girl and told her what was going on, and da da da. And I'm like, there was the only one person said that out of all the folks we interviewed, and we hired him. And he's a great guy.
Because he stands out, because it's rare, and and yet it is so necessary.
Yes.
So necessary. So yeah, I mean, it's these things that it's the little things. It's the little things that make a big difference. And whether you're talking about trust or anything, it's absolutely paramount.
Absolutely. Okay. So, and what I do like about your definition of trust too is that it is as complex as people are, right? Because you talk about the three different ones. So you talked about character and communications, and capability is next, right?
Capability. There are 4 behaviors that contribute to trust and capability. Do we acknowledge people's skills and abilities? Do we allow them to do the jobs that we hired them to do, versus micromanaging them, breathing down the throat, and telling them what to do and how to do it and so forth. There's also allowing people and encouraging people to make decisions, empowering them to make decisions. And then if we can't do that, at least do we involve them and seek their input? It's like, how do you feel, Kelly, when somebody asks you for your advice?
Oh, it's flattering. I mean, I got an opinion on everything, and I'm willing to give it.
Exactly, but they're tapping into your experience, your expertise, your talent, maybe your perspective. It's so it's a real honor. So there's that, and then lastly, it's helping people learn new skills. We can't necessarily always hire the skills that we want, but if we can help them learn and grow, and we see the innate possibilities of people and help nurture that, then we can create, not only can we create very highly contributing employees, but we build trust at the same time.
Absolutely.
And all 3 of those dimensions and the behaviors that contribute to each, Kelly, are the framework of our assessments, our statistically valid and reliable assessments. And I don't say that lightly, because it's taken us over 20 years to really, and 4 generations of each assessment to really develop them. But we have an assessment that measures trust at the individual level, the 360 level. When I say 360, are you familiar with what I mean by that?
I am, but go ahead in case there's some folks listening.
Well, for example, a 360 tool gets you yourself get feedback. You write your feedback, how you answer these questions, but also your boss, so from above, your peers from side to side, your direct reports, and then your others from around you. And so we have a leadership trust scale, a team trust scale, that it's the level of trust within the team looking at itself, and then an organizational trust scale that really takes a look at both management and employees' behavior. So this framework, the 3 dimensions of trust, really is the framework of those assessments. And those assessments, along with the work that we do, produce some pretty amazing results. We had one organization that we saved over $1 million in strategic planning costs, because we got people to more directly speak with one another versus behind their backs. We got people to bring up issues and concerns and challenges and put them forth on the table and wrestle them out. And they may not have been pretty how they brought things to the table, but they were open and honest and vulnerable. And a year later, their team trust scale, this is a senior leadership team of a very well-known airline, rose 51 points, and they saved over $1 million in strategic planning costs. So that's, this is not just a nice thing to have. This is sound business here.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah. And that's just one of examples. We had another organization who had a $30 million initiative. There was a big computer system they were implementing organization wide, and it was over budget. It was off schedule. People were at each other's throats. Departments were at one against the other, etc. We went in there 18 months later. That $30 million initiative was on track, on budget, on time, and trust rose. Trust rose 80%, and trust breaking decreased 63%.
Wow. So you do the assessments with an organization to kind of, I guess, assess where everybody's at and
Pre
people.
and post. So we do a baseline assessment of where everyone is at pre, to get a feel. Then we pinpoint the key behaviors that they want to work on. And what we do is we work in partnership with the client and develop a strategic plan to then transfer the capability to the business leaders. So it isn't Dennis and Michelle in our company going in there to do it to them. We train the trainers. We train the business leaders how to build and rebuild trust and equip them with the tools for each of these dimensions of trust, to build and rebuild trust within their respective organizations. And then we do a post-test a year or a year and a half or 2 years later and get remarkable results.
So I imagine for an organization to bring you in, they have to be feeling some kind of pain where they're willing to admit that there's some issues and get things resolved. Is that the case, or do people just want to get better too? They just want to improve their organization?
Actually, both. In the beginning, it was mostly, there were a lot of reorganizing and restructuring, downsizing, etc. And there was pain either before they would bring us in to get their team ready, or during a changed initiative, or even after to straighten things out. Now we're finding that we're getting high-performing organizations who are producing outstanding double-digit results each and every day, but they're coming to us because they don't know if they can keep up. They don't know if they can do that which is now expected of them. They don't know if they're able to, meet the game and stay in the game. And so they're coming to us to support them, to put in levels of trust and systems that they can then go to that next level, because that's what trust will do. It will take you to that next level. So you get a foundation of trust to get things working, and then you can move to your next level and your next level and your next level. So it's not just organizations that are in pain, and yes, those definitely come to us, but it's those organizations who have a need, who see the value of relationships at work and see that trust gets done versus via people working together in relationship, and value those relationships. Those are the ones who are also coming to us.
I would imagine too, as a company grows, it's harder to have that same closeness and trust that develops when you're initially starting an organization. And so that might also be a place where you need to really focus to make sure you don't lose some of that magic when you grow quickly.
Sure, absolutely. That sense of family, that sense of kinship with one another when you're a small, closely knit organization, as it expands, it does get more difficult. There's no question about it. But you don't have to sacrifice the level of trust in order to grow and expand and go to that next level.
Good. All right. Well, I'm sorry?
Oh, you can take that level of trust with you.
Perfect. So we've talked about the different dimensions of trust and how these kind of play out in different organizations. If we've got folks that are listening that know that there's some broken trust, either on their side or some of the folks that they work with, they don't trust some of the people they work with. Talk to us about those steps to restoring trust in an organization and in relationships.
Sure. So the first step, and we call this the 7 steps for healing, the 7 steps to rebuild trust in organizations. The first step, number 1, is to observe and acknowledge what has happened. Particularly, you might have gone through a change process. You may have gone through a restructuring, a reorganization, or as I said earlier, you could be growing at exponential rates and you just can't keep up. It's important that those leaders acknowledge what's happened and the impact on people. How is this going for them? And what is the effect on people? The key here is that when there is a disappointment, a letdown, a frustration, even a betrayal, people feel a loss. Mm-hmm. They feel the impact of the loss of what was, the loss of what could be. For example, the loss of that family, the loss of that close-knit, tightly weaved organization. They feel that loss because we're growing so rapidly, or they feel the loss of because Harry is no longer working with them. He may have gotten laid off. It could have been a downsizing or a restructuring, or he's working in another department now, whatever. The loss of relationships. So that needs to be acknowledged, that loss. And feelings need to be surfaced, and providing constructive forums for which people can then talk about their concerns, their issues, their fears, their anxieties, what keeps them up at night. Find appropriate ways to release their emotions in constructive forums, to be able to talk about that which is happening. So often leaders will say, okay, we went through a change process. Now get over it.
Right.
We are not, as human beings, wired that way. We have to go through, and sometimes it gets uglier and messier before it gets better. Okay, in fact, that's what mostly happens. That's why our 7 steps for healing actually takes a plunging down, acknowledging what's so, allowing the feelings to surface. And at the bottom of that curve is support. And that's what's key. If leaders can realize that their people need support when they're struggling or they're stuck, and the support to help them shift from blaming the leaders, blaming the situation, blaming the circumstances, and shift from being the victim to taking some responsibility and seeing, okay, how can I grow from this experience, and what's at stake here? And to be able to reframe the experience, which is step number 4, courageously look at what part they've played and what is going on that is contributing, and how can I now respond? Again, shifting from blame to problem solving. What's my role now? What options and opportunities do I now have? And what actions can I now take? Which takes us up to step number 5, which is taking responsibility. What can I do now? Or what can I do differently now? What actions can I now take to turn this situation around? So I'm not at the effect of it, but I'm at cause with it. I'm not a victim, but now I am taking the bull by the horns, so to speak.
Right.
And then the last 2 steps go hand in hand. Sometimes you don't even get to these last 2. Forgive yourself and others. It takes a big person with a lot of compassion to forgive the other person. But it's about shifting from that blame to that problem solving, and shifting from letting the other person. I used to always think that forgiveness was letting the other person off the hook. It's really about giving the gift of freeing yourself of the baggage of turning around, like anytime that person comes in the room or his name is mentioned, whatever, instead of reaching over and wanting to strangle the person, you're saying, you wish them well. You may not deal with them. You may not have anything to do with them, but you wish them well. And letting go there's a big difference between remembering and hanging on and letting go without blame. And that's the key. And being able to shift our focus to the future and let go of the past. And so those 7 steps leaders can take, whether it's with their leadership, with their teams, with their whole organization, they can apply that lens at any particular point in time, whether they've been hurt, whether they've been the perpetrator or believed to be the perpetrator, or whether they're, as a leader or a coach or a consultant, called in to help others. You can actually help one another. As a matter of fact, we actually wrote 2 books on the topic here. Where's my other book here? Anyway, Trust and Betrayal has a Trust and Betrayal in the Workplace has a chapter on it, but we also have another book.
I have it right here. There we
go. Right there, absolutely. Rebuilding trust. And and we wrote that from 3 vantage points: when you've been hurt, when you've hurt others, or when you've been called to help others. And there's a chapter in each step, and we take people through each step through those 3 vantage points.
Yes, and it's very, very good, very good. So as you were talking about the different steps to rebuild the trust, I remember you talking, and you talked about the different perspectives, but I remember you talking a lot about trusting yourself.
Yes.
And I think that's super important. Would you mind talking about that some more?
Yeah, in fact, that's where it all starts. And what we're talking about here, Kelly, is our capacity for trust. Our willingness and our readiness to trust ourselves impacts directly our willingness and our readiness to trust others. And the actual phenomenon starts the day we're born. And particularly those first 2 years of our development are absolutely critical to that sense of nurturing and trust that we develop as individuals. And so some people, the glass is half empty. How many people that versus half full, right?
Right.
And so for some people, the glass being half empty is show me and prove it to me until I trust you. Versus the glass is half full is, you know what? I trust you until you give me reason not to. And so I tend to come from very much a trusting perspective. And that's probably at times has hurt me, but I won't do it any other way. It's like I have learned some pretty hard lessons, and we've been betrayed by some close people and been hurt very much. And even in our field of trust here, we've been pioneering this field. We've been around longer than anybody else has. And then all of a sudden, today, everybody and his grandmother's a trust expert, literally. Yeah. They hang out a shingle, or they write an article, and now all of a sudden they're a trust expert. They know it all. And the problem is, I don't have a problem with that so much as when they steal our work and they don't give us credit for it. When they take that which we've worked and through our blood, sweat, and tears and to develop, and then call it their own and get credit for it. And some pretty big names in the field too, which I won't mention, but that's hard. But on the other hand, I've learned to say, okay, what can I learn from this? What can I gain and grow from this? How can I benefit from this? Life is teaching me some tough lessons here. And, what's my lesson to learn and grow? And so and God bless them, it's taken me a long time to get here, but I don't feel animosity towards them. In fact, sometimes I even feel a little bit of compassion and maybe even a little pity, because they had to stoop so low to steal our trust work, right? And the truth of the matter is, trust begins with me. Trust begins with you. Trust begins with each and every one of us. How can we create the trust within our own sphere of influence? And so quite frankly, trust in self is the topic of our next book that we're starting to write.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Taking a look at all the work that we've done on trust and betrayal and rebuilding trust and so forth, and really delving into trust of self, because that is so critical and so powerful. And it takes a lot of work. It takes work. This is not easy stuff here we're talking about. This takes a lot of work.
It does. It does. And one of the things that really struck me in the book too was how people will lose faith in themselves because they were trusting of somebody else, and they start questioning their own.
Oh, and that's what happens. I mean, when we feel betrayed, we start questioning not only the other person, we start questioning ourselves. And geez, maybe I thought I had what it takes. Maybe I don't. I thought I knew how to do this job. Maybe I don't.
Yeah.
I thought I could trust them. Maybe I can't.
Yeah.
So trust of self takes such a deep, deep toll on people, and it can bring people down to the depths of depression. And so our work is about lifting people and about, raising them up. And trust of self is at the core.
Very cool.
Trust begins with you.
And now I'm looking forward to your next book.
Absolutely.
All right. So we talked about rebuilding trust. There's one more thing in your book, in the first book, where you talk about transformational trust. I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, transformational or transformative trust, it's like once you have created this foundation of trust, and when people are practicing the behaviors consistently and consciously practicing the behaviors, you actually can reach, and I've only seen it in a few places in a few times, maybe in a small unit within a large organization, or a small or medium-sized company or team. But you can actually shift the level of trust and transform the nature of it so that more trust is given off than that which was invested. It reaches an exponential point and explodes, it reaches a critical point and explodes exponentially, I should say. And what we have found is there are 4 core characteristics. There's conviction, that people are clear on why they're there and what they're all about. There's courage, that they're willing to speak up and they're willing to basically say that which is not, very popular to be said. And there's compassion, though. They say it with the other person in mind, giving them the benefit of the doubt, and say it, with a compassionate heart. And there's a sense of community. There's a sense of we are in this together, and that one for all and all for one, kind of the Three Musketeers idea. But we connect at a deeper level, and we produce just phenomenal results through this level of trust. And product and, just market time is so much faster. Products get out so much quicker. Skills and abilities are utilized and respected. Coworkers have confidence in themselves and each other. And you have more confidence in yourself and your abilities. It's just amazing what happens, just the level of trust. And the things that were problems in the past becomes, jokes of the present. right?
Nice. Now, in rebuilding trust, and you're talking about the transformative. I called it by the wrong name. Transformative trust. Um, in the at the end of the second book, The Rebuilding Trust, you give an example of two gentlemen that were in a particular situation. I've forgotten their names.
Oh yeah, Dan and Stephen.
Peter and Daniel. Yeah.
Peter and Daniel, yeah.
Yeah. So I think would you mind stepping through kind of what was their story, what was going on there, and then how they applied what you're talking about, and then the end, what the relationship was like as a result of going through all this?
Sure. I
I put,
vaguely remember it.
I'm putting you on the spot because I read it recently, so it makes it easier for me to remember.
And I haven't, I mean, that was like 6 years ago that we wrote the book and so forth. But basically, Peter and Dan, if I recall, Dan worked for Peter. Was that the case?
The other way, I think Peter worked for Dan.
Peter worked for Dan. Okay, great. And
then,
those are pseudonyms, by the way, obviously, because the real people, right?
Right. And then Peter was accused of making sexual comments in front of other team members, which turned out to be false. But Daniel sent him home for a couple of weeks and then didn't talk to him or to the rest of the workers that were still there.
Right, because he had to really delve down into, what were the facts and what were the circumstances. And that ended up, actually, they're still working together many years later. But that story was a great example of them literally working through those 7 steps of acknowledging what's so, and the anguish of people coming together, and the support that Dan showed Peter, and not only not buying into the story, but really looking for the facts and really helping to understand what was going on that contributed to those circumstances, and how did Peter find himself in that situation, and then helping him to take a look at his options on what he could do, and to apologize to the person who felt this betrayal, and take responsibility for his behavior. He wasn't sexually harassing, but he did take responsibility for his behavior, and through his remorse and through his genuine, and that was the key here, the vulnerability and genuine honesty helped turn the situation around. And then eventually he was forgiven, and they actually they became best buddies later on. But he was just turned inside out as an individual. But he had to go home, and he had to sort of wait it out while all the facts were being laid out.
Well, and I think the story of Daniel as a manager, having been a manager, being in those circumstances, knowing what the HR way to do things is, it sounded perfectly normal what Daniel was doing, but the impact it had on Peter, and Peter's courage to speak up and say, "You totally ignored me. You left me out here hanging," and then Daniel took that feedback and then realized the impact it was having on the whole organization, because Daniel didn't tell anybody why Peter was gone, and on and on.
Didn't tell anybody, and Daniel and Peter up until this time were actually very close friends. I mean, they had a professional relationship of manager to employee, but they had a personal relationship as well. And, Dan really counted and relied on Peter, and Peter really looked up to Dan. And so it was a very mutually symbiotic relationship. And that's why it hurt so much for Peter when he had to go home and no one was told what was going on, etc., that everything had to be sort of hush hush until, the due diligence was done.
Right, right. Well, it's nice to hear they're still working together. That's pretty cool.
Yep. They still are, absolutely.
Very cool. Well, my last question before I'll give you a chance to maybe add any other thoughts that you might have, but my last question is, what are one or two pleasant surprises that you've come across on this journey that you've taken over the years related to trust?
Well, one comes to mind right away, Kelly, and that was, in fact, there's a little story connected to it. I was leading a workshop not too long ago, and it was a group of senior leaders, and we were talking about capacity for trust and how we trust and self-trust and everything. And we took a break, and this leader who was sitting just near the front row didn't come back for at least 45 minutes. And he finally came back and he said, Dr. Reina, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to say that what we were talking about before the break was so impactful to me that I, at the break, went out and called my wife. And I just want to say that I had the best conversation with her in 10 years.
Wow.
And so for me, what that really illustrates is this work not only just works in the workplace, this works all aspects of our lives, personally, professionally, individually, in relationships, whether we're at home or at work. People, and that's some of our greatest joys and greatest pleasures, is to hear people say, this really helped me with my team, but I can't tell you how much it's helped me with my family.
Yeah.
How much it's helped me understand them and them understand me, and how it's helped smooth out a lot of the arguments and the disagreements we've had, and that we still have different points of view. That's perfectly all right. But this work made a big difference in my life.
This must be so rewarding, so rewarding.
It's what gets us up in the morning, I mean, this is not just a job for us. This is our life's work. This is our purpose, our passion on the planet. And we work each and every day to bring this work from the inside out.
Nice. Well, Dennis, before we sign off, are there any other words that you'd like to share with the folks that are here listening?
Well, I just wanted to say that, trust begins with you. Trust begins with me. Trust begins with each and every one of us. And it's everyone's responsibility within our spheres of influence, with our friends, our families, our workers, our coworkers, the people we work with, the people we serve, that we can build trust. It may be difficult, but we can build trust with those with whom we work, and those with whom we live with, and those with whom we love.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dennis, for agreeing to come on the podcast and sharing your ideas with our folks.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com. Thanks for tuning in to Permission to Speak. If you want to increase collaboration and innovation in your organization, check out more resources available at speakingpractically.com, or give me a call, Kelly Vandever, at 770-597-1108.